Welcome everyone to today's Economics in Disaster Recovery webinar, hosted by the Bushfire and Natural Hazards Cooperative Research Centre in partnership with Deakin University. My name is Dr. John Bates and I'm the Research Director at the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC, and I'll be your MC for today. As we begin, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands from which we are all joining this meeting today, and to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and to pay my respect to any elders joining us online today. I'd also like to acknowledge the long association of traditional owners with the land, water and culture across our vast continent. We have two speakers in this morning's webinar, Ed Pikusa from the Department of Environment and Water in South Australia, and Professor Mehmet Ulubasoglu from Deakin University, the lead researcher for this work. They will provide an introduction to the use of economics to understand the impacts of disasters caused by natural hazards on individuals and on businesses, and how this information can help us to better understand where our recovery efforts are minimising ongoing impact and where there are opportunities to address areas where recovery is perhaps more difficult. If you would like to share your thoughts on social media, please use the hashtag BNHCRC or link to the CRC through @BNHCRC. Before we get to our first speaker, I will provide a quick background to the Economics in Disaster Recovery project. Understanding the economic resilience of disaster-affected communities can help build more sustainable recovery models for disasters caused by natural hazards that equitably direct funding towards the most vulnerable individuals and groups and minimise the long-term impacts. This is important because the immediate focus in the wake of disasters caused by natural hazards is typically placed on emergency and relief responses, but it takes time to realise the true economic effects of the disasters on those who are affected. In recent years, the establishment of permanent reconstruction, recovery and resilience agencies have been welcome initiatives across the country. Importantly, from a research perspective, aggregated analyses all too often mask underlying variation. This project set out to use case studies of flood, cyclone and bushfire to estimate the sector-specific economic impacts following a natural hazard disaster on individuals and on firms, to develop a ranked list of the economic sectors that would benefit from more attention for post-disaster resource allocation to minimise any potential negative effects of natural disasters, and also to see where there are similarities and differences in the findings of the case studies. Now, to provide an introduction to today's topics, economics in disaster recovery, I would like to welcome someone who many of you will know already, Mr. Ed Pikusa. Ed is currently a Principal Risk and Audit Coordinator in the Governance Unit of the Department of Environment and Water in South Australia. Ed has been an end user for this project since its inception and has worked closely with the project team to develop and interpret the case studies. Welcome, Ed.
Thank you very much, John, and thank you everyone for coming today. This is a really interesting project and has produced some really innovative and insightful results that have created a lot of thought among end users, and I hope it will today. It's one of a cluster of economic projects, one of a few, I think about 3 major projects that have been looking at the economic impacts of natural disasters, which continue to be a very important part of future policy and decision making in the sector. So it has provided a lot of important work and insights over the last few years as it delves very, very deeply into those case studies of significant events that have occurred. One of the things that really sets it apart from other projects is that it's trying to dive into the very rich and deep data sets that are relied upon for a lot of public policy, in that it really looks at the national accounts and the Australian census, which the ABS have stored and the project team have been able to get in and access in a very, very detailed way to try and draw out some fascinating insights about how individual sectors of the community are either impacted or even stimulated by natural disasters. And they've done this by starting to look at some of the larger events in our recent history, In particular, they started with the Brisbane floods, looking at what were the impacts on Brisbane compared to nearby less affected areas, and also the Black Saturday bushfires, and have moved on from there to further case studies in other states. And every time they do, they've produced a lot of insights that have really interested the end user community and wanting them to consider different pieces of state-based information or new and interesting insights that have asked more questions and provided a lot deeper understanding about how these historic events have impacted our communities. For now, we've been focusing a lot of our application efforts and our end user utilisation on a closer examination of post-event recovery and how can we better target our resources through the very expensive period of recovery to those sectors of the economy that really, really need it. And perhaps let those other sectors of the economy that are naturally stimulated by natural disasters to maybe receive a little bit less funding than they currently do, because that's, we thought, was a really interesting area of public policy. We hope today's presentation might give a few new ideas as to how this work could be implemented and some new events. So that's probably really all about I have to say. I think it's some really interesting insights from Mehmet, and I look forward to hearing them.
Thank you, Ed. We'll now move into a presentation from Professor Mehmet Ulubasoglu, our lead researcher, to introduce the project. That will be followed by a discussion between Mehmet and I to explore the findings from the research before we move into the Q&A session. And a reminder to our online audience to use the Q&A function if you would like to ask a question. We will certainly have time to address many of them this morning. I'd now like to introduce the lead researcher for the research you'll hear about today, Professor Mehmet Ulubasoglu. Mehmet is a Professor of Economics and Head of the Department of Economics at Deakin Business School, and his research focuses on the political economy of economic development, exploring topics including the relationship between the choices made by politicians and the level of welfare in a country, and analysing how the choices themselves arise due to internal and external factors within a country, such as history, natural and man-made disasters, geography, and other economic fundamentals. I've been following this project closely, and it's been wonderful for me to watch the research approach mature, to stand up to scrutiny, and there has been much scrutiny of this project as it's been going along, and to finally reveal some important messages about the recovery impacts on individuals and small businesses through the case studies. Welcome, Mehmet.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Ed, for this very nice introduction. And I would like to also thank the Bushfire and Natural Hazards CRC for supporting this project in the past 6 years. And this webinar is essentially a dissemination webinar of the findings obtained in the project in the large part of the past 6 years in collaboration with several end users and the CRC. Essentially, the overall objectives of this research is twofold. First, to estimate the impact of disasters on individuals' income using 4 case studies from Australia. And second, to use our results to inform a sustainable disaster recovery model. Our approach involves using the ABS national census data to compute the impact of the disasters on individuals' income within the next few years after the hazards. So in this way, we aim to reveal additional costs of the disasters that wouldn't normally be picked up by direct damage estimates. Our approach also involves investigating if there is any disaster effect. Did it differ according to who the individuals are and with respect to their demographic attributes and the industries they worked in? So providing more details about the socioeconomics of the disasters. As I indicated, we make use of 4 case studies in this project. And these are Black Saturday bushfires of 2009, 2J bushfires of 2009, Cyclone Oswald of 2013, and the Queensland floods of 2010 and 11. These disasters represent different type of disasters, like bushfires, cyclones, and floods, different severity of disasters, such as catastrophic disaster, a medium-scale disaster, or a small disaster. And it also represents different locations of disasters, such as regional areas, metropolitan areas, or a small town disaster. As indicated, we worked closely with our end users with our research design, and I will go over briefly that soon. But let us briefly remember our knowledge about these four disasters in recent Australian history. And the Victorian Black Saturday bushfires of 2009 were the deadliest bushfires in Australia's known history. It claimed 173 lives. It burned more than 450,000 hectares of land. According to an estimate provided by the Deloitte Access Economics, its direct damage was $7 billion. And it was quite a catastrophic disaster that ravaged through regional Victoria in 2009, February 2009. The 2J fire hit a small regional town named 2J in Western Australia. 2J is about 80 kilometers northeast of Perth. And important for our purposes, small towns like 2J make up about 10% of the Australian population. About 10% of the Australian population live in small towns. And the 2J bushfire resulted in a damage of about $100 million. It burned about 3,000 hectares of land, and it damaged or destroyed about 200 houses. Cyclone Oswald of 2013 swept through many localities in Queensland and New South Wales in January 2013. And there was obviously associated floods and heavy rainfall. The rainfall even reached 700 millimeters at some point. And in our case study, an important distinctiveness is we focus on the small business owners in the Burnett River catchment area, around the Bundaberg area. So in that sense, this project has a specific focus on small business owners. This case study. And finally, Queensland floods, again, one of the most catastrophic disasters in the recent Australian history. Our case study focuses on, the individuals living in the Brisbane River catchment area. And the disasters claimed 33 lives and, flooded more than 28,000 homes and left more than 100,000 without power. And again, according to the Deloitte Access Economics, its total tangible and intangible damages were $14 billion. To talk briefly about the project methodology, we adopt a difference in differences model. And this model is widely used in sciences, medicine, psychology, and it's increasingly being used in the economics literature lately. Essentially, here we have a shock, say a bushfire event in 2009. And we have individuals living in affected areas, which we call the treatment group. And we observe these individuals, we survey these individuals twice, in 2006 and 2011. The 2006 survey is called the baseline survey, and the 2011 survey is called the endline survey. And we have a range of information about the individuals from these surveys, including their economic characteristics, such as income, sectors of employment, mortgage payments. And we have also information about their demographic and socioeconomic characteristics, marital status, education, gender, and so on. We have also individuals from unaffected areas. We have the same information about them, as I mentioned, demographic and economic information. What is important about these individuals who live in unaffected areas is they serve control group for us. And essentially, these unaffected areas are similar to affected areas in terms of economic structure of the population, geographic structure or topographic structure of the town. And so these individuals from the unaffected areas give us a comparison group. What I mean by that is here, let's focus on the diagram here for the time being. Essentially, we compare two groups, disaster hit group and disaster unaffected group, over time, their income trajectories. And the disaster hit group is faced with a disaster in 2009 and then experiences a decline in their income level. The question here is, what would have been their income had they not had the disaster not struck them? So this income level is given to us by this orange dashed line, and essentially we obtained that from the comparison group. In other words, the reduction in income in the disaster hit group due to the disaster is a difference between the observed income that we have and the income that they would have had if the disaster had not struck them. So this is the essence of the difference in differences modeling. So in 2011, we are interested in finding out this difference, and in the medium term down the track, if there is any, in this hypothetical case, there is further income effect in 2016, and that is this difference between the observed and the counterfactual income. So this is difference and differences modeling. The next question is, what is our data set? We use the Australian Bureau of Statistics longitudinal census data of 2006, 11, and 16. This is the census that we complete every 5 years. Remember, one August night. So it is available in the form of longitudinal data set by the Australian Bureau of Statistics. What this means is that we are able to track individuals in the 10-year period, their incomes, their marital status, and their changes in socioeconomic characteristics. Obviously, it's a de-identified data set, which we access through secured servers of the ABS, and the results are cleared after vetting through, after checking through. But nevertheless, it's a census data set. It is a 5% representative sample of the Australian population. This gives us lots of observations. So the treatment group in our case studies are the individuals who live in disaster hit LGAs or SA2s, statistical areas 2s. Statistical area 2 is a geographic unit that hosts about 10,000 people. LGAs are local government areas, as we know. And our comparison groups are individuals who live in comparable LGAs or SA2s that were not hit by the disaster, but nevertheless share similar economic and topographic characteristics as the disaster hit LGAs or SA2s. Before moving on to results, let me briefly describe, what the treatment groups and what the comparison groups in each were in each case studies. In the case of Black Saturday bushfires, first of all, let me say that before getting into a case study, we do detailed geographic mapping work. That means we identify the disaster zones, we overlay them on maps, and then we carve out the LGA or SA2 information. In the case of Black Saturday bushfires, our treatment group included individuals who lived in the bushfire zones, in the burned SA2s. And the burned SA2s are given here by the red or orange color. And there were 37 SA2s burned in different degrees, in different percentages of the share of burnt area. And the control group includes individuals living in neighboring unburned SA2s. And there were 77 SA2s who were the neighbors and unburned. And our demographic profiling analysis show that these treatment and comparison groups are comparable in several respects, in economic structure, in terms of demographic structure, and our knowledge of the Victorian regional geography or economy also confirms that demographic profiling analysis. In the case of 2J bushfires, it was relatively straightforward. It was a small town disaster, and the treatment group was the individuals who lived in 2J, and the control group was the individuals who lived in the nearby SA2s, Chittering and Northam. Again, our demographic profiling analysis showed that these three SA2s were quite comparable as of 2006. Cyclone Oswald, again, this case study focuses on small business owners. And after talking to our end users, colleagues from Queensland Reconstruction Authority, we decided to focus on the Burnett River catchment area, the Bundaberg area, for LGAs, small business owners living in 4 LGAs in that area. And as a control group, again, we used our end users' field knowledge. We chose the Richmond River catchment area in New South Wales, a different jurisdiction, but nevertheless, a catchment area and a comparable economic and demographic structure, and the one that escaped Cyclone Oswald. And finally, in the Queensland floods case, as you know, it was a statewide disaster, but we focused on the Brisbane River catchment area as demonstrated on this map, 4 LGAs around the Brisbane River. And as a comparison group, again, we used the field knowledge of our end users. The Brisbane River catchment area hosting a metropolitan city like Brisbane and a few LGAs in the hinterland, we thought that other Australian capital cities, metropolitan cities, would mimic that structure. And in that sense, we chose the Yarra River catchment area and Parramatta River, Swan River, and Torrens River catchment areas that host Melbourne, Sydney, Perth, and Adelaide, respectively. So again, our demographic profiling analysis showed that as of 2006, these 5 metropolitan areas and hinterlands were comparable. But then we went forward and took additional steps to construct more comparable samples within these metropolitan areas. We applied some statistical tools called entropy balancing, which helped us pick more comparable, even more comparable individuals in terms of their economic and demographic characteristics from these metropolitan areas as comparison groups. So before moving on to questions and answers session with John, let me briefly summarize, provide a high-level summary of the 4 case studies from these 4 disasters. The extent of economic impact of disasters in Australia depends on the type, intensity, and location of the disaster, but nevertheless there were commonalities. In particular, the economic smallness is a point of vulnerability. This is a clear insight that we obtained from this project. Low-income workers, part-time employees, small business owners were generally adversely hit. They lost income after disasters. And economic smallness isn't like maybe they had less capital, less education, less time devoted to work, but nevertheless, they are vulnerable. Certain sectors also turned out to be vulnerable as a common denominator. Agriculture, accommodation, and food services, they were the first ones to be hit. We also found that certain sectors had increased economic activity, like the health sector, presumably because there is overtime work in that area and those employees earned higher income. Another important result from this project was the income divide became larger. So low income people losing out income further meant the poor became poorer. And in several cases, we found that female workers tend to lose income, and there was an increasing divide in that dimension as well. So increasing inequality was a result that came out of this project. Time frame for recovery mattered, and basically short-term, medium-term, long-term impacts of the disasters are different. Resilience to, like going back to the pre-disaster income level is different across demographic cohorts, sectoral cohorts, and in that sense, the time frame for recovery matter. And also the true cost of the disasters we find here includes income losses down the track. So beyond direct damage estimates, we document significant income losses 2 years down the track, even sometimes 5 to 6 years down the track is there, and typically these are not accounted for by direct damage estimates. So I'll leave there for now, John.
Thank you, Mehmet. Now I'd like to spend just a little time exploring with you what you found from your research before we go on to the Q&A with the audience. And I would encourage those in the audience, if you do have questions, it's a great opportunity to hear from Mehmet on what you're thinking and the interpretation of his results. So Mehmet, to kick things off, I'm interested in the difference in difference approach that you use to explore the economic impact of the defined disasters or shocks on communities. Can you talk to us a little bit about the strengths of that approach that gave you the confidence to choose that path? And then just reflect back, now that you've done the case studies, was it the right way to go?
To answer your first question, the difference in differences modeling gives us the causal impact of a shock. In other words, it helps us with an accurate estimation of the impact of a disaster. Typically, economic phenomena are convoluted. So you want to be able to isolate the impact of a particular shock. In this case, difference in differences modeling helps us tease out the income effects of a given disaster. About your second question, my confidence in the difference in differences modeling has increased after these case studies. It was able to pick up the shock effect, not only for the overall population, but also for different groups within the population. And these effects were informative, and they accorded with the economic intuition.
Yeah, thank you. So one of the other pieces that I took a lot of our time at the earlier parts of this project was looking at comparators and how we came about them. And can you talk a little bit about the approach that you've used to come up with the comparators and why getting the comparators right is such an important part of understanding the real impact of natural hazard disasters?
Sure. Selecting the right comparator group is important to be able to identify what would have been the individual's income trajectory had the disaster not struck. So this information is important for us to identify the wedge in individual's income that is caused by the disaster. So in our project, we worked closely with our end users to identify appropriate comparator groups. Our end users had the field knowledge. They assisted us with identifying the geographic areas that share similar characteristics, economic structure, socioeconomic structure, demographic structure as the disaster hit areas. So judging by the results that accord with economic intuition, I think we've done a good job, with the end users' help there.
Yeah, thank you. And I think just to sort of expand out a little bit, I think originally there was a belief that we could take just neighbouring regions and look at them. And I think do you want to talk about why you actually went particularly in the Brisbane floods to a much larger group?
Sure. That's a very good question. In the case of, for instance, Black Saturday bushfires and 2J bushfires, these are regional bushfires, regional catastrophes. So regional areas are more comparable within themselves. Okay, so neighboring SA2s would help. They would give us the nice comparator groups. But in the case of metropolitan areas, comparability probably comes from other metropolitan areas. So that's why in the case of Brisbane floods, we went to other Australian capital cities who had the metropolitan structure and the hinterland, a bit of agriculture-based hinterland, and that would mimic the Brisbane area. So, and again, we took additional steps to arrive at comparability, but that was the reason. A metropolitan versus a regional disaster is likely to have different comparator group structure.
Yeah, thanks, Mehmet. So if we look at the first bushfires first and the impacts of the bushfires, you explored two fires from 2009, the Black Saturday bushfires in Victoria and the 2DA bushfire in Western Australia. There were some significant differences between the economic impacts of those two bushfires on the incomes of the residents that were affected by those fires. Can you tell us a little bit about what your findings said about the differences between the observed impacts of the two fires and why there are differences like that from what you found?
Sure. First of all, the Black Saturday bushfires were a catastrophic disaster, and they struck large communities in regional Victoria. The 2J bushfires were of small scale that hit a regional town. In terms of the estimated impact, the Black Saturday bushfires hit almost everyone in the community. We estimated an annual income loss in the bushfire hit areas for an average citizen of about $2,000 per resident as of 2011. But details were also important. The short-term losses were concentrated in certain disaster-sensitive sectors, such as agriculture and accommodation and food services, of which tourism is also a part. For example, agricultural employees lost about $8,000 of annual income as of 2011, while the accommodation and food services employees lost about $5,000. I mean, normally you wouldn't see these estimates in tangible or intangible damage estimates. As I mentioned, the Black Saturday bushfires is mentioned to have $7 billion total damage, but this doesn't include the income flow losses down the track. So going back to the observed impacts and more disaggregated findings, we also found that there were flow-on effects from sectors onto certain demographic groups, such as female residents, part-time employees, and low-income earners. These groups are heavily represented in agriculture and tourism sectors. And importantly, we found that low-income earners and female residents exhibited weak resilience, economic resilience, in that they were not able to fully go back to their pre-disaster income levels in the medium term. So all these would mean that the income divide became larger and persistent in the medium term. You also asked about the 2J case. Our analysis didn't pick up a significant overall effect in 2J because it was a small term disaster and the recovery worked quite fast. But there were still signs of like low income and female employees might have been hit hard. But also we observed that in 2J, individuals commuted to outside areas for work. So this led to an alleviated impact in terms of like the working outside the disaster zone work like a buffer zone for the adverse income effects.
So I guess what we're starting to see out of that is some really local place-based effects depending on what the community's like, how big the impact is, and indeed where the employment sits for people that are resident in those locations.
Exactly.
So if we move to looking at I guess, the extreme weather events that you explored, Cyclone Oswald and the flooding in the Brisbane River catchment. You know, only one of those case studies, I guess, demonstrated a really significant impact on small business, and that was the impacts of Cyclone Oswald. What was that impact, and why was it so different, do you think, to the other case studies that you've looked at?
As you said, we estimated the income loss for small business owners in the Cyclone Oswald area to be quite large. In fact, our estimated figure is $21,000 per annum. And considering the number of small businesses in that area, this figure amounts to about $80 million of income loss per year. Again, this cost doesn't normally show up in damage and loss estimates. The main reason for a high loss is probably the small businesses are concentrated in disaster-sensitive industries like agriculture and tourism. Another reason could be that regional areas might experience weaker supply chains following disasters, and this would strike them for a second time.
Yeah, and I think too, in the conversations we've had about those impacts, Mehmet, you also suggested that people who were small business owners may well have had a second hit through their own personal properties, losing or having damage to their houses and a range of other things. So looking at just small business is perhaps just giving us the first glimpse into what might have happened in and around that area.
I agree, exactly. Small businesses employ about 98% of the businesses in Australia are small businesses. They employ about, if I'm not mistaken, 70% of the population in the regional areas, maybe even more. So there would be flow-on effects from small businesses onto demographics and other sectors. So yeah, that would be potentially further effects. You're right.
Yeah. So if we then compare the event of Cyclone Oswald with the flooding in Brisbane, what do you think was similar between the events?
Both disasters hit the agricultural sector. For example, in our case studies, Cyclone Oswald hit the agricultural businesses, small businesses in Burnett River catchment area. But also we identified in the Queensland floods or in the Brisbane River catchment area case study, agricultural businesses in Lockyer Valley and Somerset regional councils, they also got adversely affected.
So we might just looking at the analysis that you've done, it's linked to periodic data collections. And I guess from the example you've got is the national census as the data set. From the work that you've done, how much time do we need to wait after an event before we can remove the immediate disruptive effects from what you're seeing on income and start to pick up those ongoing impacts that are likely or have greater potential to become chronic and have long-term impacts on the residents and the communities?
Yeah, that's a good question. My answer is it depends. It depends on, first of all, the outcome that you look at. In the income case, income is typically measured annually. So that would mean short term could be 1 year, medium term could be 3 years to 4 years. If your outcome is, say, traffic accidents, it's measured daily. If it is air pollution, probably measured weekly. So the answer is depends. But in our case, because income is measured annually, the short, medium, and long-term effects, you need to wait probably for about 5 to 6 years to see if there are ongoing effects or the effects just subsided and the income levels reverted back. I mean, just to add some dimension here, to take the low-income earners and high-income earners in the Black Saturday bushfires case, low-income earners still had lower income as of 2016, but high-income earners were able to quickly go back to their 2006 income levels. So it depends on the case and what you look at.
Yeah, thank you. And the difference in difference approach that you've used is a powerful tool for looking at economic disruption following impacts or shocks on communities and regions. And I think it's important to understand that it's measuring a shock. And with the case studies that you've got, the best evidence we had was that they were the only things that happened in those intervening time periods. But can you briefly just sort of talk to the audience about how we can use this approach beyond natural hazards, which is, we developed it for that, but I think its power is much bigger.
Sure. I mean, you're right. It's a tool to pick up if the effect of a shock could be flood, could be earthquake, tsunami, drought, and so on. But in the economics literature, it's also used to understand the impact of policy changes. For example, changing tax rates on cigarettes, changes in minimum wage, education policies, or even change in traffic rules. So it has a wide application for the causal impact of a change or a shock.
And I think, Mehmet, it's probably fair to say that this approach would be fascinating to look at communities that have been impacted by fires and by the COVID-19 pandemic and the impact it's had, and difficult potentially to find comparators. But I think there's a world of research sitting there that could really look at some good insights into those communities and the impacts it's been having.
I agree. The COVID would be a nice differences approach for, say, Melbourne lockdown. In Australia, only Melbourne is experiencing that, whereas other metropolitan cities are having fun. So we would be able to understand the impact of lockdown on various outcomes such as air pollution, traffic accidents, household gas expenditure, and many other outcomes.
Yeah. And just before we go to the Q&A with the audience, are there any limitations that we need to be aware of in using this approach and interpreting the results?
Sure. Ideally, you should have comparable treatment and control groups, which wasn't difficult in our case, given the field knowledge of our end users. Still, we also took additional steps to ensure comparability. But the availability of the census data every 5 years posed a challenge in terms of isolating the effect of a particular shock, because there could be other shocks in between. Nevertheless, census data was also useful to get loss of observation and desegregations. Nevertheless, we'll check if there were additional declared disasters and declared shocks. So one caution here is our short-term effects are probably quite reliable, but the medium-term results might be compounded by additional few shocks as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Mehmet. So we now got a few questions coming through. So let's jump into the Q&A, and we will try and get through as many questions as we can this morning. If we don't get through them and there are questions left over, we'll look at a way of getting them, Mehmet, to answer them offline and share them with the audience. So one, just to start with, can we apply the differences in difference model for comparable disasters or stresses to look at differences in the pace of recovery and understand the drivers, whether they're policy or otherwise, in recovery in regions that come back versus those that are still struggling?
Ideally, you would like to be able to separate the disaster impact and the recovery impact. And the recovery impact you can only isolate if you have the data. And we had some difficulties about recovery expenditures, their sectoral desegregation, their geographic desegregation. And we would have been able to remove the recovery impact from the disaster impact itself. That we couldn't do in this project, probably one limitation that I should have mentioned. But nevertheless, our final results are net results, recovery inclusive results. Still identifying adverse effects would mean there is probably more things to be done in the recovery space.
So from the research, Mehmet, and all the conversations you've had with your end users as you've been going through it, have you been able to identify what interventions have maybe helped some sectors recover more quickly than others?
Yes, I mean, Australian National Accounts has 19 sectors. In other words, the Australian economy is divided into 19 sectors. Even though we picked up adverse impacts on agriculture and accommodation and tourism services, many other sectors exhibited no change compared to pre-disaster period. Part of the reason could be the recovery might have worked. Again, without knowing the data, we can't say, but then ex post, there was no impact. So yes, I mean, we would say that there is fair bit of amount of money injected into these economies, and they would have probably worked to some extent.
Yeah, and there's a comment, I think, from Mark Drew, who's been involved in the project for some time, just making it a comment that it's important to note that across longer periods, there are often more than one event that may affect or impact a community, and the compounding impacts of multiple events an ongoing challenge. But I think the difference in difference model still lets us understand whether the communities that have those, even if they're sequential impacts, how what happens to them is impacted relative to others that are not.
I agree. Additional shocks are an issue, especially when you don't have annual data. The only way to solve that is to have more frequent, time series data, annual data, and but then the field knowledge, the knowledge of additional disasters being there, it also helps understand or at least find commonalities, the themes in the disaster impacts.
Yeah. So I know we've got Ed's come back on for a question, and Ed, as someone that sits inside a government department in South Australia, I guess you get involved in lots of conversations around how the state's doing. From what you've seen, are there any obvious things that governments at any level can do to reduce the long-term impacts?
In terms of, well, there's always learning from your mistakes. So I think there's always, it's a bit of a tired old one, but I think we always talk about what did we learn from the last time. And I think this is a very good way of doing some post-analysis of, well, how well did this economic intervention actually work, and looking at the real data. I think the really important thing this project brings is that level of, that layer of credibility. This is the same data sets that are used for all significant economic policy interventions across all of government. So I think the really important thing is to use the insights that this gives us to design better systems into the future. So I think recognising that areas like, for example, the construction industry tends to be stimulated, so probably doesn't need assistance, is a really important point, whereas these other parts of these other sectors of the economy really do struggle and do need a lot of assistance. So making those sorts of distinctions, I think, is really, really important. But the most, in terms of what can a government do, I think it's that getting away from this idea that we have one disaster recovery policy and we apply it to every type of disaster, no matter where it is or what it is, and that we can afford to be a little bit more nuanced and even plan for the next, for this type of rural fire versus this type of urban flood, be a little bit more nuanced about, well, for these types of disasters, these are the types of strategies we'll apply, because based on evidence, they're going to do the most good. And if you can even save, relatively small percentage-wise amounts of recovery money, then that's quite a lot of dollars that can be redeployed to more useful areas. So I think it's that culture of learning and improving.
Yeah. And would you agree that if we look back over maybe just 5 years, that it's fabulous now to have a conversation that is trying to unpick some of the subtleties of recovery, because what that's saying is we are making a difference with what we do, but we're now getting some more insights that will help us make even better and more targeted impacts.
Absolutely, and I think it's the types of workers that are affected. So casual workers are affected more, or work by gender, or the really interesting things about the wealth divide and how that's actually can be increased by these sorts of events, where I think the original intent is probably not to do that. But it was even back in the early days when we were looking at the Brisbane floods, and we're saying that people in the most highly affected areas, on average, their income for the year was going up. And you sort of look at that and you go, well, that can't be right. And then they go back over and over and over. And then, of course, with a bit more analysis, that wasn't quite as obvious as that. But it really did pick up and starts to show that, well, we make a lot of assumptions, I think, about where the positive effects of our recovery dollars are going to go. And this is a useful way of objectively reviewing and helping us to improve that by that sort of idea of lessons learned. But we need the culture of learning from previous experience and making reasonable improvements along the way in order to do that. And that's, I think, where some governments still really have a challenge. They want to fall back to the tried and tested policies of the past.
So, Mehmet, picking up on some of what we were talking about with Ed just then, can you expand a little bit on the gender difference and the impacts you saw in gender? But also, if is there data in the work that you've done that talks about the divide, the growing have and have not divide that might be emerging as well?
Sure. Basically, we have done some additional analysis to dig into like gender results, and we saw a tendency that female workers had some concentration in part-time jobs, and in that sense, working part-time, they were low income, considered low income. And in the case of a shock, and when the employer or the business owner, when they have to make a decision, probably casual workforce, where female workforce is heavily concentrated, is the first to forego, maybe for a short time, even for the medium term. So in that sense, in the case of a disaster, in the case of an adverse shock, female employees tend to get hit in terms of the income effects. There was one exception though. In the case of Brisbane floods, we saw an increased health activity, and again, female workforce being heavily employed in the health sector as nurses, etc. They saw increased income, but then this is probably increased work hours, and as we saw in the COVID world, these medical staff, public health staff, they are overworked. But then the upshot is, the summary is that economically vulnerable groups are those who have low skills and low capital, and low hours, for work, and female residents are probably one of those.
Thanks, Mehmet. And the question that's been asked too is, we've used income as the economic model in this one. Are there other measures that you think might be helpful in looking at measuring and assessing economic recovery from disaster?
Sure. Income was a direct measure of well-being. We also considered that as an economic resilience indicator. Are you able to go back to your pre-disaster income level? And it determines many household decisions, many investment decisions, decisions for children, schooling, etc. It is a very strong direct measure of well-being. But of course, individual savings could be affected, their mortgage payments could be affected, their other financial decisions, even superannuation decisions, financial planning decisions could be affected. Those are subjects of different, projects probably.
Thanks, Mehmet. I think just to sort of begin to wrap up, the work that Mehmet's done and what we're finding out, feeds into the sort of research that we've been doing. We launched the Australian Disaster Resilience Index recently, which gave us an idea of not profiles, but of the capacity for resilience across Australia. This approach comes at it from a different perspective. It's now starting to break down subsets of people across the country to look at whether there are some groups of people that are more or less affected. And I think it's probably fair to say that both of these projects, this one in particular, have had what I probably call some feisty conversations. And Ed's smiling, and that was going to ask you a question in a minute. But it really is testing some assumptions and really asking people to address some hard questions. And sometimes the answers are less than comfortable. So Ed, you're involved with this project from the start. Do you think one of its intentions was to really make sure that we have the right sort of conversation, debate, push a few buttons to get conversations happening? Have we done that? I think done it in a way that's going to make change.
I think we've certainly challenged a few preconceptions about what the value of disaster, and this is really where the application down to recovery funding has come, and that's been a very debated topic over the years. There was the Productivity Commission inquiry back in 2014, 15 or thereabouts, and that was the fundamental debate in that was about recovery funding. What was then the NDRRA. So it's a very strong political overlay to those arrangements, and there is a lot of history to those arrangements. They go all the way back to Cyclone Tracy. So it's inevitable that if you start to question those assumptions, that you're going to be getting pushback from people who are very invested in the current system and the way it works. And it is, from my experience from a few years back now, it's a system that's very, very hard to change because of the way the federal system works. And the Productivity Commission shone a pretty good light on that. However, so if you do want to change that system and you see that it isn't working, you need to do it with good evidence. And I think of all the projects I've seen, this is the one that doesn't, while there is some judgment involved in the comparison populations that you choose and the events that you pick and so on, and you've got some limitations, it does in the end come back to you with a very reasoned and quantitative assessment of the effectiveness of certain interventions or not. And I think if you're going to really start to change those things and have those conversations, you've got to do it from a position that says, that comes from a very reasoned and objective perspective. And that's really where the role of the CRC, I think, is valuable and has been valuable to be able to do that, and to be able to do it over a sustained period of time. We've been doing this now for 6 years, and I think it still continues to generate challenging insights, important insights and challenging conversations as a result. And that's part of a national conversation that's going to continue for a long time to come.
Yeah. Thanks, Ed. Mehmet, I might just pass over you to some final comments and maybe to acknowledge the team that's put this together, both the researchers and the end users.
Sure, thank you. Well, this project was a step towards documenting the true cost of disasters. And typically damage and loss estimates in the aftermath of disasters, they count direct, tangible and intangible costs, but they do not include income losses down the track borne by individuals, and let alone identifying the differential impacts on socioeconomic and sectoral groups. So this project has provided estimates for income losses for short to medium term after disasters. It also showed that these costs are not borne equally. Certain groups like women, low-income earners, casual workforce, small business owners are among the hardest hit. Inequality increased after disasters. The income divide got bigger. So a clear insight from this project, as Ed said, is the recovery and relief funding could place a greater emphasis on income support for individuals. And also, as you mentioned, place matters, the disaster matters, type of the disaster matters, what the community does matters, how we provide assistance matters. So one size fits all doesn't quite work. So I hope this project has given some insights into policy making to target better the needy groups. And here I would like to acknowledge my team members, Habib and Farah, who were with me in the big part of the 6-year period. Also, I've got assistance from casual colleagues from time to time. They were always available for help. Without these colleagues, this project wouldn't have been possible. And I would like to thank them so much. I also would like to thank our end users. Ed, from the beginning, he was very supportive and understanding of the impacts of this project. From QRA, Mark Drew and Jane Carey, and from Inspector General Emergency Management, Julie Hoy, and from Western Australia, Department of Fire and Emergency Services, Tim McNaught, and finally from Commonwealth Emergency Management Australia, Marcin Pius, were all very helpful in various stages of the project. So I would like to thank them very much. And finally, I would like to thank the CRC staff, John, you, and previous research director, Mike Ramsevitz, Richard Thornton, and all other CRC support colleagues. They were always very helpful, and they were instrumental to bring this project where it is at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mehmet. And that gets us almost to the end of the webinar today. I would like to thank you all for being part of this. I think the information that Mehmet has shared with you today has really just scratched the surface, and there's more to be found from the work that he and his team have done. But I think what we've got now is a really good approach that will allow us to better understand much more of the subtleties that are associated with recovery, and really to add that to the learning that we do as we go forward, because as Mehmet rightly said, no two places are the same. There are differences, some of them subtle, some not. But looking at what we can learn from those things, and I think that the two that real standouts for me were the 2DA fires, where most of the income earning potential was outside of the 2DA region. And so the economic impact on incomes was very little. and then up to the Bundaberg region, where the cyclone Oswald went through the massive impact on small business and what it had. And I think those things are really important things that we need to put in, because it could well have been a fire that went through rather than a cyclone. You know, it's really looking at what's in there. So thank you, everybody. Each of the case studies that Mehmet and I spoke about today are summarised in publications that can be downloaded from the CRC website. If you go to the event page for today's event, there'll be a link on that page that will take you to the project information. And on that page, on the project information page, there is a publications tab that we can be found, and you can certainly get the information from there and much, much more. We are interested in your feedback on our webinars. We will send you a link via email, and it would be great to hear what you think. We do have also a couple of other events coming up very soon. Next week, we've got the Laurie Hammond Oration, and it's part of National Science Week. That will be presented by Dr. Alan Finkel, the Chief Scientist of Australia, and that's on Wednesday, the 19th of August at 4 p.m. Information is on our website. And beyond that, we do have a France and Australia Bushfire Science Workshop coming up, jointly put together by the CRC, the Group of 8, and the French Embassy in Australia, and that will be happening in the 3rd week of September. So again, thank you all. Thank you very much, Ed and Mehmet, for your participation this morning. Thank you, everybody, for listening. And everybody, stay safe. Thank you very much. Goodbye.